We were told it was impossible. What we were doing. The quantum mirror wasn't supposed to do anything more than observe fluctuations, tiny shifts in quantum particles, like watching ripples in a pond. At least, that's what they told us in the funding proposals, the press briefings, and the polished academic papers. But the truth, the part they didn't write down, was that we were chasing something far more elusive. It wasn't just about particles or energy states. It was about the big question. What happens after you die? Is there something left behind? Some thread of consciousness still tied to the fabric of reality? And if there is, could we find it? Could we see it? The lab was buried deep underground, miles away from any major city. They told us it was for safety, but I think it was because no one wanted to admit what we were really trying to do. The first time I walked into that place, it felt off. Not wrong, exactly, but not right, either. Like walking into a house that had been abandoned just a little too long. The lights were bright, the floors spotless, the equipment state-of-the-art, but there was a weight in the air, something you couldn't shake. We called the machine the quantum mirror because it sounded catchy, almost harmless, but its design was anything but simple. It was a massive array of sensors and lasers, all tuned to detect fluctuations on scales so small that they barely existed at all. The core of the system, a reflective chamber surrounded by superconducting coils, looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. When it was active, the mirror emitted this faint hum, a sound you couldn't hear with your ears but could feel in your chest, like standing too close to a giant speaker. We used to joke about it, calling it the heartbeat of the machine. But there were moments late at night when most of the team had gone home, when I swear it felt like more than that. Like it wasn't just a machine anymore. The project started slow, as these things always do. Weeks of calibration, endless hours of staring at screens full of static and meaningless data. But then, one night, something changed. We were running a standard test, sweeping the mirror's sensors across a controlled field to measure background noise when the static started to shift. At first, it looked like nothing, a ripple in the data, a hiccup in the system. But then the pattern held. It wasn't just random. It was repeating. Patel was the first to notice. He leaned in closer to the screen, his brow furrowed. "That's not noise," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. We all crowded around, squinting at the display. The ripple was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there, a rhythm almost like a pulse. "Probably just interference," someone said, but they didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. The lab was shielded from nearly every kind of interference you could think of. Whatever this was, it wasn't coming from outside. Over the next few days, we tried to replicate the anomaly. Most of the time, the screen just showed static, but every so often, the ripple would return faint and fleeting. Patel started calling it ghost data. He said it as a joke, but there was something about the way he looked at the screen, the way his voice dropped when he said it, that made the name stick. The rest of us laughed it off at first. We were scientists, after all, rational, grounded, unshakable. But the more we stared at that ripple, the harder it was to pretend it was nothing. And then came the night we decided to push the mirror further. It was Patel's idea. He wanted to tune it, as he put it, to resonate with human frequencies. "If there's a signal out there," he said, "something tied to consciousness, we're not going to find it by accident. We have to look for it directly." The idea was risky. There was no telling what kind of data we might pick up. But Patel was persuasive. He always had a way of making you feel like you were on the edge of some great discovery, like all it would take was one more step. The room felt different that night, heavier somehow. The hum of the machine seemed louder, more insistent, and the air was colder than it should have been. I remember checking the thermostat, but it was fine. Just my imagination, I told myself. The mirror activated with its usual sequence, a low thrum building to a steady pulse, the reflective chamber glowing faintly as the lasers aligned. For the first few minutes nothing happened, just static on the screens, the same as always. Then the ripple appeared. It was stronger this time, more defined. Patel leaned forward, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "It's holding," he said, his voice tight with excitement. The rest of us watched in silence as the ripple began to shift, its shape changing like a shadow moving behind frosted glass. And then, for the first time, we saw something. At first it was just a blur, indistinct and shapeless. But as Patel adjusted the system, the image grew clearer. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a shape, something moving. I felt my stomach twist as I stared at the screen. The shape was wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely inhuman either. The proportions were off, the edges too soft, like it was trying to hold itself together but couldn't quite manage it. "Is it a person?" someone whispered. No one answered. The shape shifted again, and for a moment it almost looked like a face. I couldn't make out any details, just the impression of eyes, too wide and too still, staring back at us. I looked away, my chest tight, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing back. It was still there, watching. Patel was muttering under his breath, something about energy fields and resonance. I didn't catch most of it, but I remember the way his voice cracked when the lights flickered. It was only for a second, but it was enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. The air felt colder again, heavier, and for the first time, I thought about the door, about how far underground we were, about how alone we were. The lights steadied, but something had shifted. We all felt it, though no one said a word. Patel kept his eyes locked on the screen, his fingers still moving across the keyboard, but there was a tremor in his hand that hadn't been there before. The image on the monitor had faded, dissolving back into static, but the unease lingered, like the room itself was holding its breath. "Run it again," Patel said finally, his voice tight. I wanted to tell him no, that it didn't feel right, but no one argued. Curiosity has a way of overriding fear, especially when you're standing on the edge of something unknown. So we reset the system, recalibrated the mirror, and waited. The hum returned, deeper this time, resonating in a way that made my chest feel heavy. I told myself it was just the equipment, but deep down, I knew better. The ripple came back almost immediately, stronger now, more defined. Patel leaned closer, his eyes wide, and the rest of us stood frozen, watching as the static gave way to shapes again. This time they were clearer, no longer vague shadows, but distinct forms moving in slow, deliberate patterns. At first, it was mesmerizing. The way they moved, fluid and unhurried, was almost hypnotic, like watching fish swim through murky water. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. Their movements weren't random, they were deliberate, almost aware. One of the shapes paused, hovering in place, and for a moment I could have sworn it turned toward us. "Do you see that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible over the hum of the machine. Patel nodded, his face pale. "It's responding," he muttered, more to himself than to us. Responding. The word sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't thought about it until that moment. But if the shapes were responding to us, then they had to know we were here, watching them. I didn't want to believe it, but the way that shape lingered, its form shifting like it was trying to focus, made it impossible to deny. Patel adjusted the system again, and the image sharpened further. Now we could see details, lines and textures that suggested form but defied logic. The shapes weren't solid. They were more like distortions, pockets of reality bent and twisted into something incomprehensible. One of them stretched, its edges dissolving into the static before snapping back together with an almost audible crack. It felt like the air in the room tightened with the motion, like the space around us was reacting to them. "I don't think we should be doing this," I said finally, breaking the silence. My voice sounded small, hollow, like it didn't belong to me. Patel didn't respond. He was too focused on the screen, his hands flying across the keyboard as he tried to stabilize the image. Then it happened. The static pulsed, the shapes flickering violently, and for a moment the screen went dark. When it came back, the image was clearer than ever, but it wasn't just shapes anymore. It was a scene. It looked like a room, or what was left of one. The walls were crumbling, the ceiling fractured, and everything was bathed in a pale, sickly light that seemed to come from nowhere. Shadows shifted across the floor, moving with a strange, deliberate rhythm, and in the center of the room was a figure. I can't explain what it looked like. It wasn't human. Its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. But it wasn't entirely alien either. It had the vague shape of a person, but something about it felt hollow, like it was trying to be human but didn't quite know how. Its head tilted slowly as if it could see us, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze settle on me. "Shut it down," I said, louder this time. Patel hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls. "It's just an image," he said, but his voice wavered. "It's not," I snapped. "Look at it. It's looking at us." The figure moved. Not much, just a slight tilt of its head. But it was enough. Enough to make my chest tighten. Enough to make the air in the room feel like it was pressing down on me. And then, without warning, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back right away. The darkness was suffocating. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face, but I could still hear the hum of the machine, louder now, almost deafening, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, was another sound. A voice. It wasn't speaking words. Not exactly. It was more like a low, guttural whisper, a sound that crawled under your skin and settled in your bones. I wanted to cover my ears to block it out, but I couldn't move. None of us could. We were frozen, paralyzed by the weight of that sound. When the lights finally came back on, the screen was blank. No static, no shapes, just blackness. Patel was staring at it, his face pale, his hands trembling. No one said anything for a long time. The hum of the machine had stopped, leaving the room in an oppressive silence that felt heavier than the darkness. I don't know how long we stood there, but eventually Patel spoke. "We're not done," he said quietly. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him we were done, that we needed to shut it all down and walk away, but I didn't. Because as much as I hated to admit it, I was just as curious as he was, and that curiosity was stronger than the fear, at least for now. We didn't talk much after that. There wasn't anything to say. The hum of the quantum mirror was gone, but its absence made the air in the lab feel even heavier. We should have left. Any sane person would have walked out, maybe even shut the whole thing down. But we weren't sane, not in the way that mattered. We were scientists, and curiosity has a way of eclipsing fear. Even as every instinct in my body screamed to get out, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen, what it meant. Patel stayed at the console long after the rest of us stepped back. His eyes never left the blank screen, and I could see his mind racing. He was the kind of person who didn't believe in limits. Everything was a challenge to be solved, a barrier to be broken. And now he'd seen the edge of something impossible. He wasn't going to walk away. "We need to recalibrate," he said eventually, his voice low and unsteady. "Recalibrate?" I snapped, unable to keep the fear out of my voice. "Patel, we shouldn't even be in the same room as that thing. Whatever we saw, it wasn't just data. It wasn't supposed to be possible." He looked at me then, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was fear in his eyes. "That's exactly why we can't stop," he said. "If this is what I think it is, we might be looking at proof. Real proof." "Proof of what?" someone else muttered, their voice shaking. Patel didn't answer. Or maybe he couldn't. Whatever he thought this was, he wasn't ready to say it out loud. We argued, of course. Some of us wanted to shut it all down, to report the anomaly and let someone else handle it. Others, like Patel, were too captivated by the possibility to let go. I found myself caught in the middle, torn between the gnawing fear in my gut and the maddening pull of curiosity. In the end, Patel got his way. We agreed to one more test, just to see if the anomaly could be replicated. That's what we told ourselves, at least. Deep down, we all knew we were lying. The setup took hours. Patel was meticulous, double-checking every connection, every calculation, as if precision could somehow make this safer. The rest of us moved in uneasy silence, avoiding each other's eyes. No one wanted to admit how scared they were, not even me. By the time the system was ready, the lab felt like a tomb. The hum started again as the quantum mirror powered up. Louder this time, deeper. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a vibration, a pulse that seemed to resonate through the walls, through us. I could feel it in my chest, like my own heartbeat was syncing with the machine. The monitor flickered to life, and for a moment, all I could see was static. Then the ripple returned. It was stronger this time, more defined. The shapes emerged almost immediately, but they weren't like before. They were sharper now, their edges clearer, more distinct. There was no doubt in my mind that they were aware of us. They moved with purpose, shifting and turning in ways that made my stomach churn. One of them stopped, hovering in the center of the screen, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw something in its form. Not a face, exactly, but something that felt familiar. Patel was muttering again, his hands flying over the controls. "We're close," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "Just a little more." The hum deepened, the vibrations growing stronger, and then, without warning, the shapes on the screen froze. The room fell deathly silent, and for a heartbeat I thought the system had shut down. But then the screen went black and something else appeared. It wasn't static this time, it was a doorway. At least that's what it looked like. A dark rectangular void framed by a faint, pulsing light. It didn't look like a door in the traditional sense. There were no hinges, no handle. But there was something about it that felt undeniably like an opening, a way in or a way out. "Is that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible. Patel didn't respond. He was too focused on the screen, his eyes wide and unblinking. "It's a threshold," he murmured. "We found it." The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. None of us knew what he meant. Not really. But we could all feel it. Whatever this was, it wasn't just an image. It wasn't just data. It was something real. And it was waiting for us. I don't know what possessed Patel to do it. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was something darker, something that had been pulling at him ever since this started. Whatever it was, he reached out and activated the next sequence before any of us could stop him. The hum intensified, the vibrations shaking the floor beneath us, and the light around the doorway began to pulse faster. The image on the screen grew brighter, sharper, until it felt like the entire room was being pulled into it. And then, without warning, the door opened. The moment the door opened, everything changed. It wasn't sudden, like a snap or a flash. It was slower, more insidious, like the world was quietly unraveling around us. The light from the screen didn't just brighten, it spilled into the room, a pale, sickly glow that seemed to seep into every corner. It wasn't natural light. It didn't illuminate so much as it distorted, casting shadows that didn't belong and stretching the walls in ways that made my head spin. No one spoke. No one moved. The hum from the quantum mirror had grown deeper, almost guttural, like the machine itself was alive. I could feel it in my chest, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to look away from the screen, to close my eyes and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't. None of us could. The doorway held us in its grip, an invisible force that kept our eyes locked on it. At first, the space beyond the doorway seemed empty, just a void, vast and infinite. But the longer I stared, the more I saw. Shapes, faint and shifting, emerged from the darkness. They were distant at first, like figures moving on the edge of a fog, but they were getting closer, slowly, deliberately. "Do you see them?" Patel whispered. His voice was barely audible, but in the silence of the room, it felt deafening. We all saw them. There was no denying it now. The shapes weren't just distortions. They were figures, humanoid, but wrong in ways I couldn't put into words. Their movements were fluid, almost graceful, but there was no rhythm to them, no consistency. It was like they were testing the limits of their forms, bending and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. As they moved closer, details began to emerge. Their skin, or whatever passed for it, was pale and translucent, stretched too tight over their bodies. I could see things moving beneath the surface, shifting and writhing like worms trapped under glass. They didn't have faces, not in the way we understand, but there were impressions of features, hollows where eyes should be, slits that might have been mouths. And yet, even without eyes, I could feel them watching us. Patel took a step closer to the screen, his hands trembling. "They're aware," he said, almost in awe. "They know we're here." "That's not a good thing," someone muttered, their voice shaking. I couldn't tell who it was, and I didn't care. They were right. Nothing about this was good. The figures stopped, hovering just beyond the threshold. For a moment I thought they might retreat, but then one of them raised a hand, or something that resembled a hand. The motion was slow, deliberate, and as it did, the hum of the machine shifted. It wasn't just a vibration anymore. It was a sound, low and resonant, like a distant moan. I felt it before I heard it. The voice. It wasn't coming from the machine or the screen. It was coming from everywhere, from inside my head. It wasn't speaking words, not exactly, but there was meaning in the sound, a feeling that crawled under my skin and settled in my chest. It was cold, heavy, and hollow. Patel gasped, his eyes wide. "It's trying to communicate," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "Shut it down," I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "Patel, shut it down." He ignored me. He was too focused on the figures, too mesmerized by the doorway to hear the panic in my voice. The figures were moving again, closer now, their forms becoming clearer with every step. The light from the doorway flickered, casting shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. I could feel the air growing colder, heavier, and the pressure in my chest was almost unbearable. Then the first figure stepped through. It wasn't like walking. It didn't move in a way that made sense. One moment it was on the other side of the threshold, and the next it was here, standing in the middle of the lab. The room seemed to shrink around it, the walls bending inward as if the space itself was rejecting its presence. I couldn't move, None of us could. The figure tilted its head, its hollow face turning toward Patel. He took a step back, his bravado finally crumbling. But it was too late. The figure raised its hand again, and the light in the room dimmed. It wasn't just the overhead lights, it was the light itself, as if the very concept of illumination was being pulled away. The hum grew louder, more chaotic, and the pressure in my chest became unbearable. I felt like I was being crushed, like the air was being sucked out of the room. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The light returned, the hum faded, and the figure was gone. The doorway on the screen was still there, but the figures had retreated, their forms dissolving back into the void. What just happened?" someone whispered, their voice trembling. No one answered. Patel was staring at the screen, his face pale and drawn, but there was something in his eyes, something that terrified me more than anything we'd seen. It wasn't fear. It was determination. "This isn't over," he said quietly. I don't know why we stayed. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe it was the pull of the mirror, like it had us on a leash, dragging us closer to something we couldn't begin to understand. The lab felt wrong now, like the walls were closing in, like we were no longer standing in the same reality we'd started in. And yet, no one left. No one even moved. We just stood there, caught between fear and fascination, waiting to see what Patel would do next. The screen was still glowing, the doorway pulsing faintly like it was alive. The figures were gone, or at least they'd retreated. I wanted to believe they'd left for good, that whatever we'd seen was finished, but deep down, I knew better. The air in the room felt heavy, charged, like the moment before a storm. Something was coming. We just didn't know what. Patel was the first to break the silence. "We need to run another sequence," he said, his voice shaking but steady enough to make it clear he wasn't asking. He was already moving, his hands flying over the controls, his eyes locked on the screen like he was afraid to look away. "No," I said, stepping forward. My voice came out louder than I expected, and for a moment, everyone froze. "Patel, we need to stop. We've already gone too far." He didn't look at me. "You saw what I saw," he said quietly. "We're on the verge of something incredible. We can't stop now." "Incredible?" I snapped, the fear in my chest giving way to anger. "That thing, it wasn't supposed to be here. None of this is supposed to be happening. We don't even know what we're dealing with." "That's exactly why we have to keep going," he said, finally turning to face me. His eyes were wild, desperate, and I realized then that he wasn't going to stop. Not for me, not for anyone. "Don't you get it? We've made contact. We're not just looking at the afterlife. We're interacting with it." I wanted to argue, to grab him and drag him out of the lab if I had to. But before I could say anything, the hum started again. It was different this time, lower, deeper, and it didn't come from the machine. It came from the doorway. We all turned to the screen, and my stomach dropped. The doorway was changing, the edges flickering and distorting like it was struggling to hold itself together. The void beyond it seemed closer now, darker, and I could feel it pressing against the edges of my mind, like it was trying to crawl inside. Patel didn't hesitate. He activated the next sequence, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. The doorway flared, the light pulsing erratically, and then the figures came back. This time, there were more of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, moving together in perfect silence. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were solid, their forms clearer than ever. And they weren't just watching. They were coming through. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. The first figure crossed the threshold, followed by another, and another. They moved slowly, deliberately, their hollow faces scanning the room like they were searching for something. Or someone. "We need to shut it down," I said, my voice trembling. I turned to Patel, but he wasn't listening. He was staring at the figures, his face pale, his hands frozen on the controls. The air grew colder as more figures entered the room, their movements eerily synchronized. One of them turned toward me, its head tilting slightly, and I felt my knees go weak. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was like it was inside my head, pulling at something I couldn't see. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound, not in the way we understand sound. It was a feeling, a presence that filled the room and pressed down on my mind. The words, or whatever passed for them, were fragmented, disjointed, but the meaning was clear enough. "You should not have looked." The pressure in my head intensified, and I felt something cold and sharp, like claws scraping against the inside of my skull. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything. But I was frozen, held in place by the weight of their presence. Patel was the first to break. He stumbled back, his hands clutching at his head, and I heard him muttering something under his breath. The figures turned toward him in unison, their movements slow and deliberate, and the air in the room seemed to ripple, bending and distorting like the space itself was warping around them. "We have to stop this," someone said, their voice cracking with panic. "Shut it down, Patel! Shut it down!" But Patel didn't move. He was staring at the figures, his face twisted in a mix of terror and awe. "We've gone too far," he whispered. "There's no shutting it down now." The figures stepped closer, their forms shifting and blurring as they moved. The lights in the room began to dim again, not flickering this time, but fading, like the darkness was consuming them. I could feel it too, a cold, creeping sensation that started in my chest and spread outward, seeping into my skin, my bones. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something I couldn't name. And then the doorway started to collapse. The edges flickered violently, the pulsing light becoming erratic, and the figures froze. For a moment, everything was still, the air heavy with tension, and then, all at once, the doorway imploded, pulling the figures back into the void with a deafening roar. The light vanished, the hum stopped. The lab went silent. We stood there in the darkness, too stunned to move, too terrified to speak. When the emergency lights flickered on, the room looked the same, but it felt different. The air was heavy, the walls seemed closer, and I could feel something lingering, something that hadn't left with the figures. Patel was slumped against the console, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "They're still here. They'll always be here." We didn't leave the lab that night. None of us could. It wasn't loyalty or duty keeping us there. It was fear. Fear of what might happen if we left, or worse, if we stayed. The air felt heavier than before, thick and oppressive, like it was pressing down on our lungs. Every sound seemed louder, sharper, as if the silence itself had teeth. Patel sat slumped at the console, his head in his hands, muttering to himself. The rest of us kept our distance, exchanging glances but saying nothing. What was there to say? The quantum mirror was dark now, its hum replaced by a deafening silence. But it didn't feel off. If anything, it felt more alive than ever. The reflective chamber seemed to shimmer faintly like a dying ember, and the screen wasn't blank. Not entirely. There was something there, faint and fleeting, like a shadow that disappeared every time you tried to focus on it. I tried not to look, but my eyes kept drifting back, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. Patel was the first to speak, his voice hoarse and trembling. "They're still watching," he said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Even with the doorway closed, they're still here." "No," I said, shaking my head. "The doorway collapsed. We saw it. It's over." Patel laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that sent chills down my spine. "You don't get it, do you? The doorway wasn't just a passage. It was an invitation. We opened it, and now they know we're here." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down I knew he wasn't. The feeling in the room, the cold, the weight, the sense of being watched, it hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now, more present. They were still here, just out of sight, waiting. The emergency lights cast long, flickering shadows across the walls, and every movement made my heart race. I could feel the presence of the figures, even though I couldn't see them. It was like they were just beyond the edges of my vision, always there but never quite visible. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, like I was being crushed from the inside out. Then the screen flickered. It was brief, just a flash, but it was enough to make us all freeze. The faint shadows on the monitor sharpened for an instant, taking on a shape that was unmistakably human. Or at least, it was trying to be. The proportions were wrong, the movements too smooth, too calculated, but it was close enough to send a wave of panic through the room. "Turn it off," someone said, their voice trembling. "Patel, turn it off now." Patel didn't move. He was staring at the screen, his eyes wide, his face pale. "It's too late," he whispered. "They've already crossed over." The lights dimmed again, plunging the room into a twilight that felt colder, darker, more oppressive. And then, for the first time, I heard it clearly. A sound, faint and distant, like footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they were coming closer. "Do you hear that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible. We all heard it. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the room even though there was nothing there. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, stretching and twisting like they were alive. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the corner of the lab, barely visible in the dim light. Its form was indistinct, almost blurry, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was like it was holding me in place, pinning me with its hollow, empty stare. Another figure appeared, then another, and another. They emerged from the shadows one by one, their forms shifting and flickering like they weren't fully anchored to our reality. The room grew colder with each new presence, the air thick and suffocating. I could barely breathe, barely think. All I could do was watch as they closed in around us. Patel stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at us, didn't say a word. He walked toward the quantum mirror, his eyes fixed on the reflective chamber. "I understand now," he said, his voice calm, almost serene. "It's not about them. It's about us. We were never supposed to look, never supposed to know. And now, we're part of it, Part of what?" I asked, my voice breaking. Patel turned to face me, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw something in his eyes, something dark, something hollow. "The other side," he said. Before I could respond, the figures moved. They didn't walk or lunge. They just shifted, like they were sliding through the air. The shadows stretched and twisted around us, swallowing the light. And the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed everything was Patel reaching out toward the mirror, his hand trembling. The hum returned, louder than ever, shaking the walls, the floor, my very bones. And then there was nothing. When I woke up, the lab was gone. Not destroyed, not in ruins, just gone, like it had never existed. I was lying on the cold, bare ground, surrounded by nothing but emptiness. The sky above me was black, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. I wasn't alone. The figures were still there, watching, waiting. And I realized then that Patel was right. We were never supposed to look. And now we were part of it.